June 1943, Pearl Harbor Naval Base, Hawaii. The United States Navy was deep into the Pacific War, and beneath the headlines of island invasions and naval battles, an unseen crisis was undermining its entire submarine force. The problem wasn't strategy, it wasn't training. It was a weapon, the Navy's most advanced torpedo, the Mark 14. On paper, the Mark 14 was a masterpiece. It was fast, ran deep, and carried a 643-pound TNT warhead. Combined with the Mark 6 magnetic exploder, it was supposed to detonate beneath enemy ships, splitting them apart with the shockwave of an underkeel explosion. But in reality, it didn't work. By mid-1943, submarine captains were reporting an unbelievable rate of failure. Torpedoes missed, detonated prematurely, or struck targets with a dull thud and sank harmlessly to the seabed. These weren't isolated cases. Entire patrols came back empty. Submarine commanders who risked everything to attack Japanese convoys returned home furious. They'd crept within range, launched perfect shots, and watched their weapons fail. At the Bureau of Ordnance in Washington, D.C., known simply as BUORD, officers insisted the weapon worked flawlessly. They had the test reports to prove it. The Bureau had been developing the Mark 14 since 1926, refining its guidance, its depth-keeping mechanism, and its magnetic exploder for nearly 2 decades. Laboratory trials looked perfect, but almost no live warhead testing had been done before the war. Budget constraints and secrecy meant the weapon entered service largely unproven in combat conditions. When war came in December 1941, the Mark 14 was the only torpedo available. Hundreds were loaded onto submarines across the Pacific. The first patrols revealed trouble immediately. Captains reported that torpedoes were running too deep, often 10 to 12 feet below their set depth. Others ran true but failed to explode even on direct hits. BUORD dismissed the complaints, insisting the captains were mistaken, blaming faulty aiming, bad firing angles, or improper settings. But as reports piled up from multiple submarines, patterns emerged that couldn't be ignored. Something was fundamentally wrong with the Navy's primary underwater weapon. By 1943, the situation had become critical. U.S. submarines, the silent service, were supposed to strangle Japanese supply lines. Instead, they were being hunted while their torpedoes malfunctioned. The Japanese Navy, unaware of the technical flaw, often recovered torpedoes that failed to explode. Intact, their warheads still live, it was a humiliation. The Pacific Fleet's submarine commander, Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood, had seen enough. Operating out of Pearl Harbor, he'd received too many reports of failure from his submarine captains. Lockwood trusted his men. They weren't missing, the torpedoes were. He made a decision that would ignite one of the Navy's most controversial engineering battles of the war. He would order independent tests at Pearl Harbor to find out, once and for all, what was wrong with the Mark 14. To do it, Lockwood turned to the Navy's submarine base weapons shop, a small group of engineers, machinists, and civilian draftsmen stationed at Pearl Harbor. Among them were technical specialists who had been designing and maintaining torpedo components long before the war. What Lockwood didn't yet know was that one of these civilian engineers would discover in a single night the design flaw that the Bureau of Ordnance had refused to even consider. Lockwood's first order was simple: test everything: depth control, exploders, impact pistols, every subsystem that could fail. At Pearl Harbor's West Lock range, engineers began firing torpedoes fitted with dummy warheads and recording every result. It didn't take long to confirm the first major flaw. The Mark 14 was running too deep, just as captains had reported. The cause was a faulty depth sensor, a hydrostatic mechanism calibrated in calm laboratory water, not the turbulent pressures of real ocean conditions. Correcting that problem was straightforward: recalibrate the depth mechanism. But the deeper mystery remained: the exploders. The Mark 14 carried 2 detonation systems: the magnetic exploder, which should detonate beneath a ship by sensing its magnetic field; the contact exploder, which should fire upon direct impact. Both were unreliable. In the tropical waters of the Pacific, the magnetic exploder was especially erratic, often detonating too early or not at all. Lockwood ordered his captains to deactivate it completely, relying only on direct contact hits. Even then, failures continued. The focus shifted to the contact exploder, a small mechanical device at the torpedo's nose that triggered detonation upon striking a target. It was designed years earlier at the Naval Torpedo Station, Newport, Rhode Island, under the supervision of Captain Ralph Waldo Christie, a respected ordnance officer who had championed the weapon's magnetic system. But few at Newport had ever tested the contact exploder at real-world impact speeds. In controlled tests, torpedoes were fired at slow velocities to prevent damage to test rigs. At combat speeds, more than 46 knots, the internal forces were vastly different. Now at Pearl Harbor, the engineers suspected the problem was mechanical deformation. The firing pin, the part that struck the detonator cap, might be jamming on impact, but to prove it, they needed a live test. On June 20, 1943, a Mark 14 was loaded for a test shot against a cliff face on Oahu. The explosion failed. When divers recovered the remains, the contact exploder assembly was intact. The firing pin had not struck the detonator. That night, inside a small workshop at the Pearl Harbor Torpedo Depot, a team of engineers and civilian draftsmen stayed behind to analyze the parts. Among them was William Bill H. Fredericks, a senior civilian engineer who had worked on torpedo drawings since the 1930s. Fredericks set the damaged assembly in a vise and carefully measured every component. What he found confirmed their suspicions. When the torpedo struck a target head-on, the shock load compressed the aluminum housing of the firing mechanism just enough to bend the guide rails that held the firing pin. Instead of driving forward, the pin jammed sideways. In other words, the harder the torpedo hit, the less likely it was to explode. It was an extraordinary failure of design logic, a flaw invisible in laboratory testing, but catastrophic in real combat. The Navy's deadliest weapon had been crippled by its own physics. The discovery spread quietly through the torpedo shop. Inside the humid, dimly lit building, where workbenches were lined with disassembled Mark 14s, the mood was tense but electric. What had started as another late-night inspection had turned into something far greater, a revelation that explained 2 years of failure and frustration. At the center of it all was Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood, the man commanding the entire U.S. Pacific submarine fleet. He was no stranger to technical arguments. Since 1942, he had been battling the Bureau of Ordnance in Washington, the very institution responsible for developing and certifying the Mark 14. To the Bureau, complaints from the field were exaggerations and evidence from combat inconclusive. But Lockwood trusted his captains, and the evidence now sitting on the workbench in front of him was physical proof that the Bureau's confidence had been misplaced. The Mark 14's contact exploder, the mechanical heart of the torpedo, had a critical flaw in its firing mechanism. When the weapon hit a target at a high speed or a perpendicular angle, the shock of impact flexed the thin metal guide rails that were supposed to direct the firing pin into the detonator. Instead of sliding forward, the pin jammed sideways, trapped by the very housing meant to guide it. The result? No explosion. The more accurate the shot, the more likely it was to fail. This single fact, simple, devastating, explained nearly every report from submarine captains since 1942. One of the Pearl Harbor engineers, William Bill Fredericks, spent the early hours of that morning sketching potential fixes directly onto the workbench paper. He wasn't an officer or a designer from Washington. He was a civilian draftsman who had spent his career drawing and assembling ordnance mechanisms. He understood something many of the higher-ups didn't. Real metal behaves differently than theory. His solution was remarkably simple: reduce rigidity. By removing a small amount of material inside the guide collar and adjusting the spring pressure on the firing pin, the system could absorb impact without binding. Fredericks also suggested switching to a more resilient alloy for the firing pin itself and adding a micro-clearance around the guide rails to prevent lateral locking. In effect, he loosened the tolerances, something the Navy's perfectionist engineers would never have considered during peacetime trials. Lockwood ordered the modification tested immediately. There was no time for committees or reports. A machinist began reworking the parts right there in the shop. By midday, the team had a test-ready assembly. At the Westlock firing range, The team loaded the modified exploder into a dummy warhead and mounted it on a steel test rig. Using a pneumatic ram, they simulated high-speed impact forces. For the first time, the firing pin traveled freely, striking the detonator plate cleanly. It worked on the first attempt. The next step was the real proof, a live torpedo shot. That afternoon, a submarine crew volunteered for the test. The torpedo, equipped with Fredericks' modified contact exploder, was fired at the hulk of the USS Sturgeon, an old destroyer anchored for target practice just outside Pearl Harbor. Observers watched through binoculars from the pier. The torpedo ran true, struck amidships, and detonated instantly. The explosion threw water 50 feet into the air and ripped open the destroyer's hull. The engineers erupted in cheers. 2 years of deadly malfunction, solved with a redesign that took less than a single night. Lockwood ordered a second test to confirm it wasn't luck. Another torpedo, same modifications, same range, another perfect detonation. He knew what had to come next. That evening he dictated a message to all submarine squadrons under his command. Until further notice, all contact exploders to be modified in accordance with Pearl Harbor design. It was a direct order that bypassed the Bureau of Ordnance entirely, an act of quiet rebellion in the rigid hierarchy of the Navy. But Lockwood had no patience left for bureaucracy. He was fighting a war and his men were dying with defective weapons. The order went out overnight. Across the Pacific, in Fremantle, Brisbane, Midway and Pearl Harbor itself, machinists and civilian technicians began tearing down every Mark 14 they could find. The new parts were simple enough to machine locally. Within weeks, the entire Pacific submarine fleet had adopted the fix. For the first time since the war began, American submarines were armed with torpedoes that actually worked. The results were immediate and dramatic. Patrol logs from July and August 1943 show a sharp spike in confirmed sinkings. Commanders who once returned home with frustration now radioed reports of destroyers broken in half and freighters gone in a single blast. The shift was not gradual, it was sudden, visible in the statistics. The weapon that had nearly crippled the submarine campaign had been reborn overnight. Still, Lockwood understood the political danger of what he had done. The Bureau of Ordnance in Washington had refused to acknowledge any design flaw for months, and now an unauthorized field fix had exposed its failure. If word got out, careers could end, not just at the Bureau but among those who had questioned it. For that reason, the Pearl Harbor engineers and machinists received no public acknowledgement. Their work remained classified, buried in maintenance memos and after-action notes. The official record credited field adjustments. But inside the torpedo shop, everyone knew the truth. The fix that saved the Navy's submarine campaign hadn't come from Washington. It had come from a handful of men working through the night in a hot, noisy workshop, led by a civilian draftsman who saw a problem the manuals had missed. In his private log, Lockwood wrote a single line that captured the scale of it all. If the Bureau of Ordnance were not in Washington, this war might have been won a year earlier. Those words were never meant for public release, but they expressed what every submarine captain, every machinist and every engineer in the Pacific already knew, that the Navy's most dangerous enemy during those first years of war wasn't the Japanese fleet. It was its own defective weapon. The morning reports from Pearl Harbor reached Washington in a matter of days. For the Bureau of Ordnance, the news was awkward. For months, they had denied there was anything wrong with the Mark 14 torpedo. Now, evidence from the Pacific Fleet showed not only that the torpedoes had been defective, but that the fix had already been implemented without their authorization. Inside the Bureau's offices on Constitution Avenue, officers pored over the telegrams and test reports from Hawaii. Each document confirmed the same thing. Admiral Charles Lockwood's team had solved the problem the Bureau had insisted did not exist. The revelation struck at the heart of their credibility. The Mark 14 was their creation, their pride, the result of nearly 2 decades of secret development at the Naval Torpedo Station in Newport, Rhode Island. Captain Ralph Waldo Christie, who had overseen much of that early design work, was particularly affected. Christie had been one of the Mark 6 magnetic exploder's biggest champions. His test data from the late 1930s claimed the weapon was flawless. He had vouched for it personally. Now, with combat evidence mounting that both the magnetic and contact exploders had failed, The Bureau's reputation and Christie's were on the line. But in the Pacific, there was little time for politics. Lockwood's modified exploders were performing flawlessly. In early July, submarine patrols out of Midway and Brisbane began reporting unprecedented success. The USS Tinosa scored direct hits that destroyed 2 Japanese cargo ships in one day. The USS Bowfin, Wahoo and Harder returned from patrols with kill totals that dwarfed anything seen in 1942. The change was so sudden that Lockwood ordered a statistical review. In the months before the fix, roughly 1 in 3 torpedo hits resulted in a confirmed sinking. After the redesign, that number jumped to over 9 in 10. The data was undeniable. The Mark 14 was finally doing what it had been built to do. Still, Lockwood refused to celebrate publicly. He knew the cost. For nearly 2 years, American submariners had risked their lives with weapons that could not be trusted. Patrols had been lost because failed torpedoes gave away their positions. Men had died in depth charge attacks that followed duds. The fix had come too late for them. At Pearl Harbor, the small civilian team responsible for the breakthrough went back to work without ceremony. Their benches were cluttered with disassembled pistols, firing pins, and pressure plates. They refined the new design, standardizing every measurement so the modification could be replicated at other depots. They drafted new blueprints, each one labeled Type 14 Mod 3, field adjustment authorized by Commander Submarines Pacific Fleet. It was the first time in the Navy's records that an entire weapon modification had been approved and distributed from a forward base rather than Washington. Meanwhile, the Bureau of Ordnance tried to save face. Internal memoranda framed the Pacific fix as a temporary field measure, a stopgap until the Bureau could re-examine the system under laboratory conditions. But those conditions no longer mattered. The battlefield results spoke louder than any report. In late August, Lockwood received a curt message from BUORD acknowledging his data. The Bureau admitted, in carefully worded phrasing, that the field modification has produced satisfactory detonations, but nowhere did they concede that the original design had been defective. It was a bureaucratic victory, not an engineering one. Lockwood, now emboldened, went further. He ordered another test series, this time aimed squarely at disproving the Bureau's last defense, the magnetic exploder. He instructed submarines to fire pairs of torpedoes, one using the magnetic setting, one on contact only, and to report results. By the end of the tests, the verdict was clear. The magnetic feature was unreliable in tropical waters, often detonating early due to anomalies in the Earth's magnetic field. It was permanently deactivated fleet-wide by autumn 1943. The simplified, mechanical-only Mark 14, with Fredericks' redesigned contact exploder, became the Pacific Fleet's standard torpedo for the remainder of the war. The results were transformative. In the 12 months following the fix, U.S. submarines sank over 2 million tons of Japanese shipping, crippling the enemy's logistics network. The Mark 14, once a symbol of frustration, became a weapon of precision. For the first time, American submarine captains could rely on their equipment. The war at sea changed course. Japanese supply convoys, already strained, began collapsing. Oil tankers vanished beneath the surface. Merchant ships no longer dared to sail unescorted. Every torpedo fired now carried the weight of 2 years of pent-up failure and vengeance. Still, within the engineering offices at Pearl Harbor, the credit remained unspoken. The men who had solved the problem, machinists, draftsmen, and engineers, were civilians. They were not eligible for medals or citations. Their work was classified under restricted ordnance modifications. Lockwood, however, never forgot them. In a private letter to Admiral Chester Nimitz that fall, he wrote, "The success of our submarine campaign owes much to the practical men at Pearl Harbor, those who work with tools and torpedoes, not with paper. Their insight saved the fleet." In Washington, that sentiment was never repeated. BUORD eventually issued an internal bulletin describing the fix, but the names of the Pearl Harbor team were omitted. The Bureau's official narrative credited ongoing technical evaluation and field adaptation. Behind the scenes, Christie, who had defended the original design, quietly requested reassignment. The torpedo station at Newport shifted to other projects. For all its sophistication, the Navy's most advanced laboratory had been outperformed by a handful of field engineers with wrenches and blueprints. By late 1943, the Pacific Fleet was winning its undersea war. The same submarines that once returned from fruitless patrols were now returning heroes. Ships like the Wahoo, the Tang, and the Flasher achieved legendary kill totals, striking fear into Japanese shipping routes. The Mark XIV had gone from the Navy's greatest embarrassment to its most lethal asset. And yet, in the memory of those who were there, one image persisted. A group of exhausted engineers and draftsmen working through the night in June 1943, surrounded by metal fragments and oil-stained drawings, proving what bureaucracy had refused to believe. Their names would never appear in headlines, but the explosions that followed, the shockwaves that tore through enemy ships across the Pacific, carried their fingerprints on every detonator. September 1945, Washington, D.C. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. Across the Pacific, American submarines were returning to port, their decks crowded with weary sailors who had survived one of the most brutal undersea campaigns in naval history. Behind the parades and headlines, the Mark XIV torpedo, once the Navy's most controversial weapon, had become a symbol of quiet redemption. It had helped win the Pacific War, but its success had come at a staggering cost, and the story of how it was finally fixed remained buried in reports stamped classified. In the months after victory, Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood was summoned to Washington to brief the Navy's Board of Ordnance review. The topic: post-war evaluation of submarine weapons performance. Lockwood, who had spent 3 years commanding the Pacific submarine fleet, arrived armed with statistics and frustration. He had fought 2 wars, one against Japan and one against the Bureau of Ordnance. Before the assembled officers, Lockwood outlined the numbers. From 1941 to early 1943, U.S. submarines had fired more than 1,500 torpedoes. Fewer than half of those that struck their targets had detonated. Dozens of patrols returned empty-handed, despite flawless attack runs. Hundreds of sailors were lost in counterattacks triggered by dud torpedoes. He paused before adding, "When we finally fixed it ourselves, the results were immediate. Sinkings tripled, convoys collapsed. That change alone may have shortened the war by a year." Across the table sat officers from the Bureau of Ordnance, many of whom had dismissed the Pacific Fleet's complaints as field exaggerations. Their faces were tight and unreadable. The Bureau's official position remained cautious. The Mark XIV had been improved during operations, but not defective by design. Lockwood said little more. His tone stayed professional, but his point was clear. The Bureau's refusal to accept frontline evidence had cost time, ships, and lives. Behind the scenes, however, the Navy began to document the truth. The Submarine Torpedo Reliability Board, formed after the war, reviewed the full record of the Mark XIV's development and failures. Its findings, declassified years later, confirmed what the engineers at Pearl Harbor had proven in 1943. The contact exploder was flawed from the beginning. The magnetic feature had been unreliable in real ocean conditions, and the Bureau's testing procedures had been fundamentally inadequate. In effect, the Navy's most vital weapon had entered combat without ever having been properly tested under combat conditions. The irony was bitter. The United States had pioneered industrial mass production and scientific management, yet its most sophisticated weapon had failed because no one had hit a target with it at full speed before declaring it ready. The post-war report was careful not to assign individual blame. Names were omitted, and the civilian engineers at Pearl Harbor who solved the problem were never officially recognized. Among those forgotten were the machinists and draftsmen who had worked that night in June 1943, men like William H. Fredericks, whose redesign of the contact exploder turned the Mark XIV from a liability into a war-winning weapon. Their contributions remained classified until decades later, when naval historians began piecing together the record from Lockwood's diaries and archived maintenance logs. In his retirement, Lockwood became one of the few officers willing to speak openly about what had happened. He wrote in his memoir, Sink 'em All, "At Pearl Harbor, we learned what Washington would not admit, that the Mark XIV's contact exploder was faulty. It was the field engineers, not the Bureau, who finally solved it. Their work was done quietly, without recognition, but every Japanese ship sunk since 1943 owes something to those men. It was as close to an official acknowledgement as they would ever receive. Meanwhile, the Bureau of Ordnance underwent quiet reform. The Navy's entire weapons development system was overhauled to include field testing, combat trials, and direct reporting from operational units. The lesson of the Mark 14 became institutional policy. No weapon, no matter how advanced, would ever again be deployed without real-world testing. The failure had forced modernization, a painful but necessary correction. In Pearl Harbor, the old torpedo shop was dismantled after the war. The benches where the redesign had taken place were cleared, the drawings archived in steel cabinets marked obsolete. The men who had worked there returned to civilian life, many of them never speaking publicly about what they had done. They weren't heroes in the traditional sense, no medals, no press releases. But within the circles of the submarine force, their achievement was quietly understood. When veterans gathered years later, they would still talk about the night the torpedo finally worked. As for the weapon itself, the Mark 14 continued in service into the 1950s, later upgraded for post-war submarines. Its flaws, once catastrophic, had been erased by experience and necessity. Future generations of torpedoes, the Mark 18, the electric Mark 27, the acoustic Mark 37, all inherited one vital principle born from that crisis. The weapon must be tested by those who will use it. By the late 1940s, the official narrative of the war had moved on to bigger stories: aircraft carriers, atomic bombs, and grand strategy. The Mark 14's troubled past faded from memory, but for those who had lived it, the lesson was personal. Technology could win wars, but arrogance could prolong them. Rear Admiral Lockwood retired in 1947. On his last day of service, he wrote a brief note to the staff of his submarine command. It read, "Never forget that truth comes from the men in the field. The ocean tests everything." In the archives of the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance, his reports on the torpedo crisis were filed away, labeled historical, resolved. But the mark it left on naval engineering was permanent. The episode of the Mark 14 became a quiet turning point, proof that wars are not only won by admirals and tacticians, but also by the unseen hands of engineers, draftsmen, and machinists who refused to accept the impossible. They had no rank, no medals, and no authority. Yet in one night at Pearl Harbor, they solved the Navy's deadliest problem, and in doing so helped change the course of the Pacific War.